Christian Hansen has been improving food and health for more than 140 years, and to this day, we produce ingredients consumed daily by more than 1 billion people worldwide. We work continuously to develop the products of tomorrow, enabling farmers to produce the high-quality, sustainable, and safe food that global consumers demand. All this is accomplished from our strong platforms in bioscience technologies, combined with extensive research and in close dialogue with our customers and business partners. This is why we call our approach science-based, research-proven.
Okay, staying along the same theme, and I think a topic, really interesting perspective and topic to kind of round out this session for this afternoon. We're joined by Dr. Keith Erlandson. Dr. Erlandson received his Doctor of Veterinary Medicine degree from Iowa State back in 2004. He also earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Animal Science in 2000 and his Master's degree in Veterinary Microbiology in 2004 from Iowa State University. In 2011, he became a diplomat of the American Board of Veterinary Practitioners in the swine health management specialty. In 2015, he earned his Master's of Business Administration degree from the University of South Dakota. Dr. Erlandson has worked as a private swine consultant, staff veterinarian for a production company, and a professional services veterinarian for a pharmaceutical company. For 5 years, he was the director of swine veterinary medicine for a top 3 pork producer in China before joining Zoetis as a senior technical services veterinarian in 2020. So interested to hear Dr. Erlandson's perspective on African swine fever, and if you'd join to welcome me, Dr. Erlandson, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I get to round out the series of 3 speakers to scare you about things. I'm going to talk about my experiences with African swine fever in China. From 2015 to 2020, I had the opportunity to direct a team of veterinarians for an integrator in China. And as most of you know, during that period of time, African swine fever came to China. So I had some firsthand experience with that disease for 2 years. So August 3rd of 2018 was the first announcement of African swine fever in China. We had done preparations, we'd done some tabletop gaming, that kind of stuff, so you can prepare, but until you're into it, I don't know that you can ever be fully prepared. As soon as African swine fever, as soon as the announcement was made, all of our farms basically went into complete lockdown. For those of you who don't know or aren't familiar with, most of our farms in China, the staff lived on site, so they would arrive at the site, shower into the dormitory. They would live at the dormitory for 4 weeks to 6 weeks, and then every day they would shower into the production facility. So nobody left the fenced-in perimeter at all. And as soon as African swine fever was announced, there were some farms we had where nobody nobody came into the farm or left the farm for almost 6 months. The first case was in Liaoning province, announced in August. The second case, about 2 weeks later, was in Henan province. That was at a slaughter plant, and which one's is there a laser on this? That one, okay. So there's about 1,500 kilometers between these 2 provinces. These pigs that tested positive actually were moved illegally from Liaoning province. And they happened to test the slaughter facility that day and found those pigs to be ASF positive. Then it jumped to Jiangsu province. Then it jumped to Zhejiang province, and then Anhui province. So within a month of the first detection of ASF in China, we already have 5 provinces affected. And then it kept moving throughout the country. So by mid-October, we were up to 9 provinces, and it just kept going. Until we get to February of 2019, and by April of 2019, the entire country is infected with African swine fever, up to and including the island of these pig-dense provinces, especially here on the East Coast, were devastated. I went to help some of my veterinarians inspect some farms that had been depopulated, thinking that we're going to repopulate those farms. We drove by a facility that had a feed mill, 50,000 sows, and all the associated finishers on one site, and everything was gone. Shandong province, basically one of the top 5 provinces in China for pig production, did not have a pig industry anymore. Everything was gone. One interesting thing that's come to light since then is this report on August 3rd may not have been the original case. Going back into March, there were tissues from pigs that had tested positive. So, you know, if something similar were to happen in the United States, especially if it gets into an area that you know, isn't pig dense or doesn't have a lot of veterinarians familiar with pig diseases, it could simmer in an area for a while before anybody really noticed. And the interesting thing about African swine fever is when I graduated vet school, I thought, you know, if I run into a case of African swine fever, I'm going to walk in the door of that barn and I'm going to know, boom, it's African swine fever. I mean, the textbook says it's very apparent and it's highly infectious and it moves fast. And let me tell you, that is not the case. I tell people that you almost have to have 2 completely different opinions about African swine fever that are mutually exclusive, yet you have to hold them both true at the same time. On one hand, you have to consider African swine fever virus to be highly infective, that moves very fast and kills pigs quickly. But on the other hand, you also have to know that African swine fever takes a while to infect pigs. Clinical signs aren't always completely obvious, and it moves very slowly. And as we go through this, I hope to demonstrate to you why you have to hold those 2 diametrically opposed opinions at the same time and hold them both to be true. When foot and mouth disease gets in, it ramps up very quickly, and you detect it pretty quickly. Lots of animals get sick very quickly. Classical swine fever, probably not as fast and not as many get infected, but it still moves rather quickly. African swine fever takes a long time to get ramped up. It may be a while before the disease gets to the point where you really, it starts to raise some flags and you're concerned that something's going on. So if we look at a pen of 100 pigs, if these diseases infect one pig with foot and mouth disease, very quickly they're all going to be infected. You may have 1 or 2 mortalities, but you're going to see everybody's infected, and you're probably going to see clinical signs. With classical swine fever, not all of them will get infected, but you'll see lots of clinical signs, and you'll see plenty of deads. With African swine fever, when that one pig gets infected, it takes a while to move around, and you're going to have lots of dead pigs, but these other 90 pigs here don't look too bad yet. Nothing's happened with them yet. And you can see if you've got a farm with 1,000 pigs and your threshold is set, if it gets above 3% mortality, we're going to do something. Well, 3% mortality is 30 pigs. Think about the last time PRRS broke on one of your farms. And the producer called and said, hey, I've got 30 pigs dead this week. And you went, well, PRRS is going through the area. That's probably what it is. I'll put them on some aspirin and I'll come see you next week. Okay. Well, what if PRRS was floating around the area, but it wasn't PRRS that was killing these pigs, it was African swine fever? So this is what we saw when we go to a farm with ASF, and these are pictures from a sow farm, one of the first farms I had infected with African swine fever. We did see some abortions, but abortions were not a major symptom or major sign on these farms. We did see quite a bit of vomiting. Sows would go off feed, and the ones that weren't off feed, a lot of those would exhibit vomiting. This is probably the major clinical sign we saw. You'd walk in the morning and drop feed, and a whole row of sows would just refuse to get up. And what we found out is if these sows refused to get up today, the day after tomorrow, they would be dead. Once they start showing clinical signs, the decline in those animals is very, very rapid. And as you can see, 2 days ago, these sows were off feed, and now they're dead and have already been removed. And you see their compatriots across the alleyway. These sows are not up, don't want to eat today either. African swine fever is a hemorrhagic disease, so we would see a lot of sows, once they started to become ill, would have very erythematous red to purple ears, and their noses especially would become very red and hemorrhagic. Any small trauma to the skin, and those pigs would just bleed and bleed and bleed. Early on, we tried to treat sows, and you could tell exactly where the needle had gone in, because that sow would have just blood dripping down the side of her neck. It would not clot. It wouldn't stop bleeding. Another picture of a sow with red ears and a red nose. And as they get worse and worse, they start hemorrhaging from the mouth, the nose, and the anus. Post-mortem, significant hemorrhage everywhere. As soon as we cut these sows open, I was always under the opinion if you cut a sow open and you can find a lymph node, it's probably enlarged. When we cut these sows open post-mortem, the lymph nodes just popped out at us. We'd see hemorrhages on all the serosal surfaces, especially the small intestines. More hemorrhages. We did see some hemorrhages underneath the skin, but this was not a terribly common lesion that we would find. Hemorrhagic lymph nodes, very enlarged and very hemorrhagic. And probably one of the most striking features is enlargement of spleens. You cut these sows open, and the spleen would just pop out through the incision. There's a variety of different spleens we saw. Probably one of the largest I saw. This is my assistant, Dr. Sheng Bin. He stands about 5 feet 6 inches tall for reference. He's not a very big guy. And then a lot of these spleens would be very friable. When you start to manipulate them in any way, they just crack apart. And I hope you can see this well, but turkey egg kidneys, petechial hemorrhages on the surfaces of those kidneys. Almost every sow or every animal we necropsy had those petechial hemorrhages. And then the final disposition of those animals. So I'll tell you about the first farm I encountered where we broke with African swine fever. This happened in late August into September of 2018. It was a 2,400 head sow farm. And integrated around that sow farm were 7 finishers that it sent pigs to, all of those within about a 10-kilometer radius. They produced about 60,000 pigs per year. So for reference, Liaoning province is right up here. That's where the first case was diagnosed on August 3rd. This farm, as the crow flies, is about 7 kilometers from that very first case. So the first case happened and actually I think, so you'll see here, it's a very flat agricultural area. A lot of corn gets grown around this area. The city of Shenyang is right here, and then it's near the smaller town of Shenbei. So this is an aerial picture of the farm, 2,400 head sow farm. There's a fence that goes all the way around the farm. This is the dormitory. This is the kitchen and dining room. This is a truck wash / warehouse. This is the boiler room. So in this area they burn a lot of coal, and all the heat is through hot water. So that's the boiler. This is just a storage shed. This is the farm office. It's a 2-story structure. So, and down here, it's not in this picture, but is the front gate. So when you arrive, you shower in at the front gate and leave all your personal possessions in a locker. You shower in and wear farm-specific clothes, and then stay in the dormitory. And every morning you go to this building and shower in and then go to work. There's an isolation barn over here, and then gilt acclimation barn, crated gilt breeding and gestation barn, the farrowing house, breeding barn, and then manure management and lagoons here. This is the, I don't remember what that is, and this is the old compost site. This is an area where they used to dry manure and then sell the dried manure to local farmers. That was no longer in use at the time this happened. And really, once you're inside this farm, other than the signs telling you you're in breeding or gestation that are written in Chinese, you wouldn't be able to tell where in the world you are. It's a completely modern hog farm on the inside. So, the original, the break of African swine fever was announced on the 3rd of August. On the 6th, this farm was shut down. Nobody went in or went out after the 6th. They had people that came by and disinfected the road in front of the farm at least 3 times per day, every day. All of the walkways and roads within the farm were disinfected at least 3 times per day, every day. Basically, the only thing that came in was feed for the animals and food for the people that worked on the farm. On the 26th of August, 4 boars were found to be off feed. Those 4 boars were located in this corner right here. They were found to be off feed, and then for some reason, I mean, they were in this corner, the 4 crates in this corner, as far to the corner as you could get. They were found to be off feed, and then for some reason, I never determined why, those 4 animals were moved from here to the other side of the barn to approximately here. The next day, 2 of those boars died, and then 3 sows were off feed the next day. And from the diagnosis until in that following week, pigs around that area where the original case was found were depopulated. Okay. And then for a couple days, nothing interesting happens. Or actually about 10 days. Then we start to see some dead pigs, more and more sows off feed. It started to look like a PRRS break, according to the vet on site. He really thought they had PRRS. I got the call the evening of the 11th. One of my veterinarians on site called me and said, "Dr. Erlandson, I don't think this is PRRS. Can you come?" So Dr. Rich French, Rich was a pathologist with us at the time, flew to Shenyang, and we stayed at the farm for 10 days. And every day, more and more sows off feed. And what we found was 2 days after they went off feed, they died. And this continued day after day. So you see, from the original infection of those 4 boars on the 28th, really until you start to notice anything that's really bad, you're almost to the 8th of September. It doesn't just pop overnight. It takes a little while to gain some momentum. And then you see it starts really gaining momentum. Now, this is early on in the infection process, so The local government, the provincial government, even the countrywide government in China is still trying to get a hand around what's going on. Testing capacity for African swine fever is overwhelmed, and at this point we could only send samples to government laboratories. We didn't have our own testing capacities. So, a lot of people are very busy and don't know exactly what to do. Probably about the 13th or 14th, Dr. French and I were convinced, we have African swine fever. We've cut enough sows open. We've seen enough lesions. That's what we have. But because nobody knew what was going on, it took another week to 10 days before the decision was made to depopulate. So you see here, this is kind of just a graph of the data I showed you before, but here we had some pigs off feed and a couple deaths, and then not much happens, and then all of a sudden it starts to go up really quickly. And we have a lot of off-feed sows, dead sows, and then it drops off when we decide to depopulate. So it takes a while to get started, but once it gets going, it starts going pretty quickly. So you see, from the time if we would in hindsight, we knew this is when it got in, or this is when the first clinical signs appeared, it was really 13 days later before we really knew what was going on. The interesting thing is, once we knew what was going on, we stopped all movements, and all of these finishing farms, I believe the last pigs there were delivered about the 10th of September. All of these finishing farms raised those pigs out and sold them to slaughter. None of those finishing farms ever broke with African swine fever. So that was my first experience shortly after African swine fever was detected in China. And we came to quickly realize that diagnosing the disease and then doing a complete depopulation was not a sustainable way to deal with the disease. One, because after about 6 months, everybody started to understand that it's now endemic and we're just going to have to learn to live with it. So we started to rethink our processes, and we had developed capabilities to test for the disease in our own laboratories. So we along with other companies in China, and my veterinarians, obviously I don't speak very good Chinese, but my veterinarians had good contacts with other veterinarians and other systems. And we worked and really developed a test and remove system that got to be very good. We'll still lose animals, but in many cases we can save the farm. So I'll walk you through what happened with one of those situations. So this was a farm in southern China. Their monitoring protocol was any dead sows or dead gilts, they would collect some sort of sample from that animal, blood if possible, otherwise a swab from the thoracic cavity. And really, once an animal is infected with ASF, you just have to get a swab of some fluid and the virus will be there. What they would do is collect samples from each of those dead animals and then hold them on the farm, and then once a week they would send them to the laboratory for testing. As it so happened, this sow the sample was collected on September 24th. And there was another sow that was sampled, but the date that she was actually sampled was unclear. But then those two samples were sent to the lab and tested on October 1st. So they were identified as African swine fever positive. This is a layout of the farm where those animals came from. This is the farrowing house. This is breeding and gestation. This is gilt breeding and acclimate. This is gilt acclimation and some breeding. This is the guardhouse, the area where you shower into the farm, and the dormitory, and this is the farm office. This is the kitchen where the staff eats. and then the lagoon down here. So the animals that were tested positive, one of them came from a row in the breeding barn, and as luck would have it, that animal came out of a group that was due to farrow. So between the time that that animal died and the sample was tested, those animals from that row had already been moved out of the gestation barn into rooms 12, 14, and 16 of the farrowing barn. So as soon as those positive samples came back, sows from this area of the barn were immediately culled, as well as all the sows in rooms 12, 14, and 16. And then more samples from sows and environmental samples were taken. You can see the green triangles are environmental samples that were tested negative. But then we did take environmental samples from that row and the hallway in which those sows went down, and did find some positive samples along there. So on October 1st, we did culling. We also sampled some of those sows, did environmental samples, and then cleaned everything up, washed and disinfected, and things were. We thought we had gotten rid of everybody. Then they went through and did another whole herd test via oral swabs on the 18th of October. And interestingly enough, we found some positive samples on that testing from the 18th over here in C row on the other end of the barn. So those animals were subsequently depopulated, and I don't have the testing up here, but after that depopulation of that subset of animals on the 18th of October, future testing was always negative for those animals. So about a month after the initial positive signs, we declared that this farm was free of ASF. In all, we culled about 400 sows, and took about a month and 400 sows, so 400 out of 2,400, and the farm has been ASF negative since. And yes, 400 animals is quite a big hit to a farm, but on the other hand, it's still a functioning farm, and we didn't lose everything. We've done, and they continue to do, test and remove procedures. What we found is in about 70% of the cases, if we find the African swine fever virus early enough, we have a 70% chance of saving the farm. And some cases that's 20% of the animals. In some cases, we do round after round, and we might get down to 50% of the animals. But again, it's 50% more than we would have had if we would have just depopulated straight away. The other 30%, we may do multiple rounds of testing, but the virus, we either got there too late or the virus just jumped and got ahead of us, and we're not able to save the farm. So some biosecurity adjustments that, that our system made after African swine fever was found in the country. So I told you before, to get to the farm, I would arrive at the farm, shower into the living area, spend the night there before I was allowed to shower into the actual farm. Now in the system I worked in and many others, the first step is to go to an off-site containment area where you will take a shower, put on site-specific clothes, have your hands and shoes swabbed for ASF, and stay overnight. And once you've stayed overnight and the ASF swab comes back negative, you go to a second isolation area and do the same thing, spend another night. And in some cases, that may be 2 nights. Once that's cleared, you'll actually go to the farm and be allowed to shower into the living area, where you'll spend another night, and then the next day be allowed to go into the farm. So from the time you arrive until you can actually go into a barn and see a pig is somewhere between 3 or 4 days. I'll show you here what we've done in a lot of our system for management of trucking. So most of the farms are operated in kind of a pod system where there's a sow farm that feeds 6 or 7 or 8 wean to finish farms depending on the capacity. And within that system, we'll have at least 2 and in some cases 3 truck washes. And at least 2 of those truck washes will have the capability to bake a trailer as well. So if we look at the feed truck, it starts at the feed mill. It goes to the middle truck wash where it's washed, disinfected, and baked dry. Once it's confirmed to be done there, it goes to a second truck wash where again it's washed, disinfected, dried, and baked. Then that feed truck will go either to the sow farm or to the wean to finish farm to deliver feed, but it won't actually enter the farm site. It will either dump the feed into a central bin that it can just reach the stinger across the fence and dump feed into that bin, or if that's not feasible, that farm will have a separate feed truck that never leaves the site, and the feed truck that's originating from the feed mill will dump its feed into that truck, which will then deliver it to the various barns on that site. When we get ready to sell pigs from one of these wean to finish farms, we have dedicated internal trailers, so that truck will load the pigs up to at the wean to finish farm. It will take them to a transfer station, where those pigs will be transferred from this internal truck to an external truck that will take them to the slaughter plant. When this first truck is done, it will go to the truck wash, be washed, disinfected, dried, go to the second truck wash, washed, disinfected, and dried before it's allowed to return to the wean to finish farm or the sow farm. The second truck that takes the slaughter pigs to the cull sows to slaughter, once it's done there, it goes to a third truck wash where it's at least washed and disinfected. We would like to have drying capacity at this site. Oftentimes it's just a wash and disinfect, and then it comes back and gets washed, disinfected, and dried before it's allowed to come back to the transfer station. So a significant investment in capital as far as adding trucking capacity, and not only do you now have 2 trucks to get a pig to market, but you've got the additional time and labor to load that pig twice. And as all of you know here, loading the pig the first time isn't any fun, let alone once he's got an idea of what's going on and you have to load him again. Just an idea of the extent that they've gone to in China to try to combat this disease. And yet, even though that there's no visitors to the farm, everything's washed, disinfected, and dried at least twice, all the supplies go through 2 or 3 disinfection processes, yet we still have farms that break with African swine fever. So is that insects? Is that rodents? Is that area spread or aerosol spread? Is it feed? Could be any of those, could be all of those. But it's something that we don't have figured out yet. Here in the last 6 months or so, northern China had another huge outbreak of African swine fever and lost between 25 and 50% of the sow herd. So even though we go to huge extremes to try to keep these farms safe, in a lot of cases, we still break. Now that's been sustainable over the last couple of years because of the price in pigs in China. I did a calculation about 2.5 years ago and figured that if we started up 3 farms, as long as one of them weaned 6 months worth of pigs that got to market, it was a break-even proposition. Now with hog prices in China starting to fall now, it's not as lucrative as it was, but there's still incentive to repopulate those farms. I'd like to thank people I worked with over in China, Yang Li, Dr. Shi, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Lei Teng, and Dr. Li Shengbin. My Chinese colleagues that I worked with extensively, Richard French, a pathologist from here in the US that helped me get through my first diagnosis of African swine fever, and Gary Stoner, my boss while I was over there. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. If we don't get to your question today, that's my email address. Feel free to send me an email if you have other questions or something wasn't clear today. So thank you very much. Dr. D.
Nice job, as always. What's your plan for feed mitigation? Do you have additives, feeding, pelleting? What are you currently doing for reducing that risk? We know it's a true risk.
I'm not sure what they're doing now. We talked about it and went back and forth. We did quite a bit of feed testing, and as of a year or so ago, they were not doing any feed mitigation because we didn't believe that that was a major source of infection. That may have changed now, but as of then, we were not doing any feed mitigations.
And if I can expand on that, how was feed testing being done? How were you sampling?
I don't know their sampling program. I don't know that we were sampling complete feed, but I do know that they were sampling a lot of the ingredients that were coming in, including corn and soybean meal, but I don't know what their sampling protocol was. Yes, sir.
When you're looking for ASF, when you're doing your test and remove, where do you, or how do you find it? Is it the oral? Is it blood issue? How do you find it?
Sure. So if you're doing more of a passive surveillance, you're just monitoring. What I found there is collecting samples from animals that die is a very easy way to do it. Once a farm has been diagnosed, what we would do is go through and do a whole herd test using oral swabs. They're just like a swab like a nasal swab you'd use for testing influenza. It's just a cotton swab in a tube. It's been a little bit since I looked at the data. I don't recall exactly. They're not quite as good as, say, testing serum or whole blood would be, but the advantage there is in 99% of the cases, especially in sows, you don't have to restrain the animal, so there's no snare that's going to possibly transmit disease. And two, it's very easy to train someone to get a sample from a sow's mouth. A lot of times they'll come up and chew on it. So it's much easier to train them to do that than to train everybody to take whole blood samples. And then we would pool those in pools of 5 based on their location. So we knew, crates 1 through 5 are one pool, crates 6 through 10 are the next pool. If any of those pools came back positive, then we would test individually. But before the testing was even done, we'd start depopulating an area around those positive pools.
Just want to follow up. You had a common water problem?
Yes, these barns all had a common water trough. It really didn't. I mean, the disease did spread in that area, so I'm sure the water trough carried some of it. But was it a case where the sow in crate 1 got ASF and 30 or 40 crates down? I don't think we saw that. But that being said, a lot of farms have gone in and they've put in a break or a barrier every 5 crates or so, which I think is a good idea. It gives you a little better idea of what to depopulate if you're doing a partial depopulation. At least you know that these weren't sharing water. So.
Kate, could you touch briefly on a cleaning SOP
Yeah, so the first farms, we thought we had to be down for 6 months and wash and disinfect at least 3 times. What we found with the test and remove is once we get those sows out of there, we wash that area and then disinfect it. In some cases, we'll use a whitewash lime solution. But once we do that, I can't say that we've had a re-break due to environmental contamination after it's been washed and disinfected with a commercial disinfectant. So You know, a lot of literature would say that virus is very, very hardy and resistant to disinfection. I would say, in my experience, it's probably not near as tough as we think it is if you do a good job removing the organic material and applying a commercial disinfectant. Sir?
Yeah, I noticed early in the presentation you had some photos of carcass disposal and large holes dug outside. Maybe my eyes deceived me, but were you guys putting anything on those carcasses before you buried them? I thought I saw white powder or something.
Yeah, they were putting quicklime on top of those carcasses. So they'd put a layer of quicklime down, then put the sows, and then cover those sows in quicklime. Sarah?
What kind of continuous monitoring do they have, I guess? You know, you said that this one farm was considered ASF negative, right? Do they have a continuous monitoring process for those operations?
Yeah, so the question was, do we have a continuous monitoring process? Most of the farms, the monitoring process is testing dead pigs or taking samples from dead pigs and then running those on a twice weekly or weekly basis. That seems to be, because when you have a negative situation, testing a lot of pigs that are all negative doesn't get you very far. It's testing the animals that are most likely to have the disease when you're monitoring seems to be the way to go. So animals that die, getting a sample from those is probably the number one thing we do to monitor. If there's a situation where we have suspicion, we'll do either a very large sample or even a whole herd testing to confirm or rule out whether or not African swine fever has gotten into the farm.
Any more questions? All right. Well, thank you, Keith. Very helpful insight and really a valuable insight, I think, to kind of help bring awareness to what the situation could be in the event of an African swine fever outbreak. I believe that.